But for today's topic, a very timely and topical issue, we're having a session on the Philippines, and in particular Duterte's violent populism. We're very lucky to have a Professor Mark Thompson with us today from the Department of Asian and International Studies in the City University of Hong Kong. As you all no doubt know, since becoming Philippine president in June 2016, Rodrigo Duterte has launched a violent crackdown on drugs, with thousands killed by police and vigilantes. Elected in a free and fair election, Duterte rules in an illiberal but not yet explicitly anti-democratic fashion, with the press uncensored and the powers of Congress as of yet not formally curtailed. Although he has tried to establish close ties to communists and promised greater efforts to reduce poverty and taken a nationalist stance against the US, his chief domestic priority has been implementing a subnational authoritarian Davao model nationally. So to expand on all of this, Professor Thompson is the head of the Department of Asian and International Studies, as well as the director of the Southeast Asia Research Centre at the City University of Hong Kong, and he's a renowned expert on the Philippines in particular. He's an author of The Anti-Marcos Struggle, 1995, Democratic Revolution, 2004, co-editor of Dynasties and Female Political Leaders in Asia, co-author of The Vote in the Philippines, Electing a Strongman, and he's an editor-author of a recent special in the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs. He's also a commentator in The Diplomat, Huffington Post, and others. So we are very delighted to have Professor Thompson to bring us through this topic, and could you all please give him a warm welcome to the FCC. Professor Thompson.
Thanks very much, Inda, for that kind introduction. Thanks also to the club, to the FCC, for this kind invitation. I realize I'm competing with the delicious main course here, but we do have the television screens. If you're concentrating on your food, you can just glance up at the screens. I guess this is a bit of an innovation. I've been told that this isn't done too often with PowerPoint. For those of you familiar with the university scene these days, everybody uses PowerPoint. Power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. We live with, our students depend on it. We also depend on it, so I hope you'll excuse these this visual aid here. I'm also happy, of course, that the FCC is having a talk on Southeast Asia. Since moving to Hong Kong several years ago, I've noticed that people in Hong Kong tend to be concerned, even obsessed with three countries. The first, of course, is China. The second is China, and the third is China. So it's nice that we look beyond that, of course, also given the fact that the Philippines is very important to Hong Kong for a variety of reasons, including, of course, the fact that there are about 200,000 Filipinos living in this city. It's also, I think, an interesting place to hold a talk. I was in the Sandra Burton room for a little cocktail, although I didn't imbibe too much. I hope I'm coherent during the talk. Sandra Burton, as some of you will know, was a very important person in this club, very well-known journalist who was on the plane when Benigno Ninoy Aquino was assassinated in 1983 at the Manila airport. She was close to Cory Aquino, and she received a Golden Heart Medal from Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, who was president when she gave it to Burton in 2004. Interesting point is Macapagal-Arroyo was part of the anti-Marcos struggle, but later, after revelations came out that she had stolen the 2004 elections, Cory Aquino called for her resignation, so they became enemies, political enemies. So it's good that Sandra Burton got the medal in 2004, because I'm sure as associated with Cory Aquino, she would have been less likely to receive it a year later. The name of Burton's book was Impossible Dream. And she was writing about the so-called people power uprising known in the Philippines as the EDSA Revolution, which overthrew the dictator Ferdinand y Marcos. And it's kind of interesting to think how much things have changed 30 years on, a generation on, how the people power revolution seems very far away with Duterte's violent crackdown on drugs. So that's what I want to start with, the past politics of liberal reform in the Philippines. And so what happened, given the extreme corruption, cronyism of the Marcos dictatorship, a democratic good governance narrative emerged among oppositionists, and these were not just the politicians opposed to Marcos, but also business leaders. The Catholic Church, of course, played a very prominent role. Also key were a number of civil society activists, and in the end, it was part of the military that broke away, which was decisive for the largely peaceful overthrow of the Marcos dictatorship. And this narrative of good governance by good people legitimated Cory Aquino, even though her presidency was very troubled. She was president from 86 to 92. Fidel Ramos, her successor, who was one of those military leaders who'd broken away from Marcos, had a much more successful presidency. The economic crisis was overcome, growth restored, at least until the Asian financial crisis. Military coups ended. Ramos, as a former general, was able to get the military under control, and he implemented this seemingly important good governance platform, liberalizing the economy. And when he was succeeded by Joseph Estrada, largely because of the inability of the post-Marcos presidents at that point to deal with poverty and unemployment, which I'll talk about in a second, Joseph Estrada, a movie star, populist politician who ran on a platform, won easily in 1998, but was quickly accused of corruption. And this old people power coalition came back together: the Catholic Church, the politicians, including Cory Aquino, civil society, and ultimately part of the military again broke away, allowing this time an elected, fairly and freely elected leader to be overthrown in 2001, bringing in Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, who I just mentioned. And she herself was engulfed in scandal, this stolen election 2004, a series of corruption scandals. So the liberal reformist project seemed to have reached a dead end until Cory Aquino died in 2009. And that led to a sort of a national grieving, a huge funeral procession, and sort of the anointment of her son, Benigno Noynoy Aquino, as the favored presidential candidate who in fact won the 2010 election, seemingly reviving this idea of liberal reformism. But with the pork barrel scandal, the inability to build up decent infrastructure, those of you who have been to Manila know its infrastructure is much worse than most other surrounding Asian cities. It's poor disaster management. Think of the Haiyan typhoon called Yolanda in the Philippines. Crime problems. And of course, as I said, despite high growth, persistent poverty. So Aquino remained personally popular, in large part probably because he didn't have the scandals that plagued the Arroyo administration. But I would argue that on the whole, the narrative he had, the liberal reformist narrative, was discredited. So that paved the way for Duterte. And the interesting thing about Duterte is he was the first presidential candidate to so openly break with this idea of good governance in a liberal framework. Instead, he promised a bloody drug war, and Filipinos found this so convincing that if you can see the chart here, Filipinos were understandably more concerned for long periods of time about inflation, about the pay of workers, reducing poverty, creating more jobs. But suddenly, with Duterte's candidacy, the concern about crime goes up, becomes very important, the dominant issue, although it then declines again after that. So Duterte manages to instrumentalize the idea of Philippine society out of control, drugs being the source of the problem, to sort of come up with this order over law kind of narrative. And the effectiveness, the appeal of this is, given the weak institutions in the Philippines, he was able to sort of radicalize the idea of reformism, and he could use his experience as mayor of Davao intermittently for the last 30 years. He changed this city from a seemingly lawless place to one that was well ordered, and he'd also had an anti-drug war campaign within Davao itself. He could use this kind of as his calling card, and this appealed very much to the urban middle class, which, while benefiting from growth, had increasing security fears, and he built up a new coalition. The police, of course, a very important role in this coalition. Left nationalists, communists have been important, although that's been on and off. And he had a regional base in the Visayas and Mindanao. So let me show you a couple of tables here. I'm not sure how easy they are to read, but first of all, Duterte had a regional strength. If you see the bottom of the first map here on the left, that's Davao and Duterte's hometown. That's Mindanao. Duterte's hometown, Davao, is there. So his core strength was that southern island, and then moving up into the Visayas in the middle of the country, the Cebuano speakers. So Duterte is not only a politician from the south, but he's also a Cebuano speaker, the second largest ethno-linguistic group in the Philippines. And he was very popular, that's the second table here, in cities, particularly in Metro Manila, but also in Cebu, the second city of the Philippines, where he got disproportionately high amounts of votes. So why is that? Well, in local areas in the Philippines, political machinery is still largely intact, so people vote according to the political loyalties of their leading politicians, but in cities they're more open to appeals during the campaigns, and that's why Duterte's law and order appeals resonated there particularly well. And finally, the last table shows that he did particularly well among what in the Philippines are called the ABC voters, the elites and upper and middle class. Somewhat less well under the lower middle class, and then least well among the poor voters. That's changed. Duterte has become popular across class lines, but it's interesting to point out that his popularity was initially strongest among the wealthiest, and I think the answer to why that is clear. They would be the ones who have the largest security concerns, as the people who have the most to lose given the recent economic growth. Now, I'm not sure whether in the age of Donald Trump such a slide is appropriate. Maybe it is. Things have changed. Duterte out-Trumps Trump in terms of his language. He's brought the coarse language of local politics to the national level in the Philippines. He is willing to say things as they are, which gives many Filipinos a sense of his authenticity, the willingness to really say it like it is. This has been, of course, amplified by social media, his promises for real change, and his willingness to call foreign leaders SOBs in the case of Obama, or to tell the EU to, I use the abbreviation FU, I don't want to go too far in this distinguished company here. So when Duterte was elected in May 2016, coming to power the month thereafter, he literally stuck to his guns. Extrajudicial killings began immediately, with police promised immunity, weakening already vulnerable institutions. He quickly seized control of Congress, not illegally. In fact, this is a tradition in the Philippines, given the power of patronage that the president has. He's able to attract his previous opponents, including the Liberal Party, the party of the previous president, Noynoy Aquino. He launched these personal attacks on foreign critics, as I mentioned, but also domestic critics. And one of the most important episodes in that regard is his criticism of Laila de Lima. I'll talk about her a little bit later. She was the most outspoken member of the Senate against the killings from the beginning. She'd also had investigated his killings in Davao in previous roles as Justice Secretary. He had criticized key institutions such as the church, which was surprising to many people who thought that the Catholic Church was largely untouchable, threatened the courts, and particularly, of course, the Commission on Human Rights. This is a legacy of the People Power Revolution. There were certain independent institutions, also the ombudsman in the Philippines, set up to curb government abuses, particularly in regards to police and military powers. He put the Commission on Human Rights under pressure, and that pressure continues to this day, as well as, I said, allies and international institutions. Despite all this, his popularity soared, going as high as 90%, with half of all Filipinos telling Pew in a recent survey that they favor autocratic rule. So what I want to suggest is what Duterte has brought to the Philippines is a new form of reactionary politics. And this is a little bit confusing, perhaps because of his overtures to the communist left. They're on and off negotiations. Apparently, rumor has it that they may soon be resumed. There are unfulfilled promises, however, of land reform, still a major problem in the Philippines. Unequal distribution of land that was promised under Marcos. It didn't get implemented sufficiently. Cory Aquino didn't follow through with that promise. There's also the issue of short-term contracts. Duterte promised to end that. That hasn't been implemented yet either. Some people point to Duterte's willingness to take on oligarchs, and it's true. He's leaned on Lucio Tan, one of the leading cronies of Marcos, later of Estrada. Other oligarchs who have been targeted include, for some of you who know Philippine politics, Ong Pin, the Lopezes, the Prietos. But he's aided oligarchs allied with him, and this is also a pattern you see in Philippine politics. Marcos did that, attacking some oligarchs, helping others, bringing new cronies to prominence. And interestingly, in the case of Duterte, he's targeted oligarchs who run newspapers. The Philippine Daily Inquirer is one of the most important. Some of you will know that paper, and it's been taken over by an oligarch allied with Duterte, and it's unclear what the implication will be for the viewpoint of that newspaper. The Marcoses and the Arroyos provided important campaign funding for Duterte. He saw to it that Arroyo was released from hospital arrest, and the Marcoses got their burial of their patriarch, Ferdinand Marcos, finally received a hero's burial. This had been a controversy for 3 decades, and finally under Duterte, this burial took place. What he's chiefly done, of course, however, is to prioritize his drug war. And this drug war has been carried out by the police, but also by vigilantes based on a list of suspects that are gathered at the local level. Human rights groups such as Amnesty International have pointed to a political economy of murder where there's an incentive system in place where people are rewarded, police are rewarded for each kill in the drug war, rewarded more than for arrests and for other ways of dealing with this matter. Danilo Reyes, who's with us today, has discussed this as violence as spectacle to discourage the investigation of killings in the drug war. And Nicole Carato has spoken of the fantasy of penal populism, which suggests that there's a virtuous public which is being defended by Duterte. Duterte has been called the punisher. Actually, he's more the protector. He's seen as the person protecting, the patriarch protecting ordinary Filipinos from these degenerates, and he's saying that the drug scourge is at the heart of basically all social evils confronting the Philippines. Now, when you look at the killings themselves, it's interesting that though this drug war has been declared by Duterte and it's a national undertaking, it has local variation. So when you look into the killings more specifically, there are more killings in urban areas, but there are also more killings within urban areas in those parts. In this case, the second graph here shows this. More killings in those parts of Manila where mayors are closely allied with Duterte. And this is also true in other provinces. So where in provinces where the local politicians are not so keen on the drug war, you'll see fewer killings. When they're quite enthusiastic, there will be more. So it's an important point is even though the drug war is national, the killings tend to be concentrated in certain areas, particularly these urban ones. And if we ask the question, how does that then place the Philippines internationally in terms of killings by police? The Philippines was always reasonably high, as the graph up to 2015 shows. But if you can see the second one, now killings by police are much higher than, say, in South Africa, Brazil, with killings in Manila now at 70, as opposed to, say, South Africa's 4.7. And knowing the violence of South Africa, that's quite a shocking statistic. Another important point about the drug war is we really don't know how many people have been killed. And the reason we don't know that is because the authorities don't want us to know that. There's kind of a media war going on about this, and very familiar phrase, the accusation of fake news. So Philippine newspapers, particularly the Philippine Daily Inquirer, but also the Center for Investigative Journalism, which is, I'm using their data here, have been very influential in trying to document these killings. But whereas at first the government was bragging about it, saying, look at what we're doing to stop the drug problem, look at all these drug users and dealers have been killed, suddenly with the international and domestic criticism mounting, they changed their tune, saying, well, actually you, our critics, are exaggerating the numbers. And so this table on the left, without going into detail, shows how the figures will vary according to the concepts used. And one concept in particular that's been controversial is so-called deaths under investigation. So we don't know precisely how many people have been killed. I'm working currently on a project to try to get a better understanding of how that is, but it's a deeply politicized issue. But it's fair to say that thousands have been killed, and the estimate of 7,000 has been batted about around. That may be a little bit high, but we are dealing with a large number of killings, and I was asked earlier about how that compares with the deaths during the Marcos dictatorship. During the last years of Marcos, there were extrajudicial killings. Amnesty estimates there were slightly over 3,000. We probably have surpassed that. Though, however, of course, many tens of thousands, even up to 100,000 were killed in other ways during the dictatorship, including a very vicious war in the Sulu archipelago in the early years of the dictatorship. But it's clearly an episode that involves a large number of deaths. The number of arrests is 72,000. The number of those who have surrendered, 1.2 million. And through this operation where houses are visited, people are asked whether they're taking drugs or selling them. That's been 7 million, according to police figures. Now, here's another interesting statistic. Filipinos strongly back this drug war, about 80% in a recent survey, despite the fact that they admit that this campaign involves extrajudicial killings, or EJKs, and they themselves are afraid that they may be targeted. So it's a very interesting and ambivalent situation, and of course there have been a lot of poor people who have been killed in this drug war, many of them former Duterte supporters. So it's a very interesting situation where people feel deeply ambivalent, worried about safety in their own communities, but understanding that the police may even target their own children, and there have been a number of minors killed recently. The month of August was a particularly bloody one. In fact, a couple of days during that month were reportedly the ones with the highest number of killings, including of Kian de los Santos, who's pictured here, who was 17 years old at the time, and most evidence seems to suggest he was an innocent bystander, mistakenly targeted and extrajudicially killed. It was caught on a security camera, the way he was arrested and taken away by 3 policemen. Duterte reacted to that. There were protests in Manila about this, claiming the Philippine National Police will no longer be in charge of the drug war. This operation, which I've been talking about, has in the Philippines is called Tok Tok Hangyo. It's a combination of knocking on people's doors, pleading with them, abbreviated as Tokhang. So this is one of the most fearsome things of the drug war. Anytime the police can come around your neighborhood, knock on your door. Of course, if you're in a condo or a house in one of the gated communities of Manila, the chances are the police won't be knocking on your door. They won't be even admitted into your suburb. So it clearly has a class bias. He's supposedly given the authority over the drug war to the Philippine Drug Administration, which claims to have less violent techniques in implementing it. But according to a number of sources, the killings in the drug war, perhaps at a lower level, are continuing. So where are we in terms of the state of democracy in the Philippines? As was mentioned at the beginning, in the summary of the talk, I would argue that the country is not yet authoritarian. Duterte was fairly and freely elected. He's clearly is still a popular president. The press is largely uncensored, even if some friendly oligarchs are taking over some of the more critical newspapers. There have been brief Senate investigations, and the courts are not yet officially gagged, although clearly intimidated. But there are signs of democratic consolidation, deconsolidation, in 3 levels. Behaviorally, clearly, the way the drug war is being conducted, the way that this sort of liberal discourse, which had dominated the Philippines for the last 3 decades, is being transgressed. Some of you will remember Duterte's very unfortunate comparison of his drug war with the Nazi Holocaust. But that's just one of a number of outrageous and illiberal statements. And one leading critic of Duterte has admitted that it's sadly, when Duterte does things like this, it's not only that many Filipinos allow it, let them get away with it, as it were, but they clap along with it, they approve of it. So it's resonating. This has led to a behavioral change. Institutionally, Congress is clearly under Duterte's control. The courts have been cowed, and independent institutions such as the Commission on Human Rights and the Ombudsman have been intimidated. And attitudinally, this support for strongman rule, which I mentioned, 50%, and Duterte's massive continued strong popularity, it's gone down slightly, but popularity of around 80%, despite his illiberality. Another issue I wanted to address briefly is the foreign policy side of Duterte. One of the other colorful things he's been up to, of course, saying he would separate from the U.S., choose China as his new partner, which was very surprising in the context of the Philippines, in which the previous president, Aquino, had confronted China, even gone to a tribunal trying to get a decision about the South China Sea dispute, which the Philippines actually won. The decision came out in July of last year, shortly after Duterte was elected. And surprise, surprise, Duterte decides to do nothing with it. Instead, he goes to China and says, I want to work with you. I want to separate from the U.S. Now, one thing one can say, of course, is this involved a certain amount of rebalancing, which is typical of the small states of Southeast Asia vis-a-vis the U.S. and China. You see this in Thailand after the military coup there. You get criticism from the West, the U.S. in particular. In order to defend yourself against that, you move more toward China. The economic transactional benefits of being China's new friend are clear. In Thailand, tourism, particularly mainland tourism, has boomed recently, and the Philippines hopes for similar benefits from getting close to China. But there's also, of course, this issue of illiberal realignment, that Duterte clearly was upset about the Obama administration's criticisms, those of the EU and human rights organizations as well. And it's nice to have a friend like China, which doesn't raise these kind of points, that's more understanding of the kind of human rights record that Duterte has compiled. At the same time, he's had to keep the support of the military and police, and the Philippine military has been historically very close to the U.S. And in the Marawi conflict, it turned out he was quite reliant on U.S. military equipment, though he tried to play that down a bit. So also with the election of Donald Trump, things have changed back again. Trump, of course, will be in the Philippines very soon, and he's repeatedly praised Duterte's drug war. One of Duterte's allies has been appointed special envoy, and that ally happens to be the builder of the Trump Tower in Metro Manila. So there are some ties there between the two presidents. Also, their political styles are similar. So perhaps this switching sides is a bit exaggerated. Thanks to a new U.S. president who's much more understanding of Duterte's policies, we see potentially a warming of ties again between the U.S. and the Philippines. I wanted to address economic consequences of Duterte. The background, of course, was this economic crisis. This was after the Aquino assassination in 1983. And the Philippines basically stagnated for about 15 years. And then the Asian economic crisis hit. And then its growth model took off in the 2000s, driven by business processing outsourcing. Overseas foreign workers have been very important in the Philippines, about 10% of the population, as I said, nearly 200,000 of them here in Hong Kong. But consumption has been the driver. The middle class has been the main beneficiary, and thus poverty persists despite high inequality. There are also signs of the Dutch disease, as it's been called in the Philippines, premature industrialization and an overvalued peso, although under Duterte that's changed. Foreign direct investment has fallen by about 90% in 1 year under Duterte, and there are many who believe that this, while it may have a cyclical aspect, is related to foreigners' concerns about the law and order situation in the Philippines. There's also a sense that the BPO industry may have reached the limits of its growth. It grew very rapidly over the last 15 years. And even the market for overseas foreign workers may not be what it once was. Just to finish up here, I want to talk about the opposition briefly and highlight the fact that it's perhaps not particularly surprising that women have been very prominent in among those opposing Duterte. And this is part of a Philippine tradition that goes back to Cory Aquino. Cory was the saintly figure who stood against Marcos, who himself complained that he was being portrayed as the devil himself, as he called it, in that campaign, the snap election of 1986. Duterte used all sorts of misogynist techniques to attack Lila de Lima, who I mentioned earlier, his leading critic in the Senate, slut-shaming her, as some critics called it. Eventually, she was jailed by a friendly judge, but she's still heard. She's able to speak from a jail cell. Recently received a major award. Remains an important symbol of opposition. She was jailed supposedly for having links to drug lords. So Duterte was trying to say my leading critic is actually herself part of this problem. Duterte's vice president, very interesting, the Philippines, the vice president is elected separately, is also an opponent of Duterte, but she was ejected from the cabinet. She's been subject to troll attacks and demonstrations even calling for her removal. The Catholic Church has found its voice, as has civil society. There have been increasing protests. Scandals have mounted. Unexplained wealth within the Duterte administration, and perhaps the most embarrassing revelations of all, circumstantial evidence that Duterte's son was linked to a drug smuggling syndicate that recently was caught smuggling in 6 billion pesos worth of drugs into the Philippines, the very problem Duterte is supposedly combating. And do I have a couple more minutes? Sure. Or okay, so just put this in a regional perspective. I would argue that if you look at the situation in Thailand, there's some similarity that you did have after a uprising against a military regime in the early 1990s. You also had a kind of liberal reformist period, but there was an economic crisis from which there was a slow recovery, economic inequality, and in that context, Thaksin Shinawatra emerges, interestingly, also waging a war on drugs in 2003, although it was shorter lived with about 2,000 deaths. But later elites turned on Thaksin, who then changed his tune, appealing more to the poor. So there's some interesting similarities there. In Indonesia, Jokowi, the Joko Widodo, the Indonesian president, has openly said, I would like to imitate Duterte's drug war, although I want to point out that we did it earlier. There was also a kind of violent drug crackdown under Suharto, the Indonesian dictator, called Petrus in the early 1980s. And this has also occurred as the economy has stagnated and reforms have faltered. You also see the rise of increasingly violent intolerance in Indonesia of religious and sexual minorities. There was the right nationalist Prabowo Subianto, who almost won the 2014 election. There's been a kind of informal coalition forming between these right nationalists and Islamist extremists, and the most notorious case was the jailing of the former governor of Jakarta, known as Ahok, on charges of blasphemy against Islam, Ahok being ethnic Chinese Christian. And then Donald Trump and the kind of rich country illiberal populism. Again, I would say there's some similarities in the fact that, you could see Obama as standing for this kind of reformism in a liberal context, and like Trump, Duterte using a backstage discourse, making shallow promises of social reform, using nationalist appeals, looking to former friends as foes, in the Philippine case, China, Trump, of course, with his Russia connection. Important difference, though, is the closed populism of Trump and the European populist right, anti-immigrant, anti-free trade. In the Philippine context, like most developing countries, the Philippines is open to globalization, feels like it's a beneficiary, particularly with the importance about country migration. It's a key source of foreign capital to the country. Foreign investment is important in the business processing, outsourcing industry. The call centers are very important in the Philippines. And the crucial differences, of course, in the context of very weak institutions in the Philippines, Duterte's violent drug crackdown is seen as a useful way to protect the good people from those bad drug users and dealers. Thank you very much. Okay.
Great. Well, Professor, thank you very much indeed. We'll go to Q&A session now, and I might kick it off, if I may. Just given what you've outlined, Professor, could you give us a sense as to whether or not his base, to do a Trump parallel, his core support is still holding up and supporting his policies, or is that being eroded to the point where his holding office is uncertain?
There have been a couple of opinion poll surveys recently. One showed a slight decline in his popularity, but another, a more recent one, showed it holding firm at about 80%. So if Trump's base is around 35%, Duterte's base at the moment seems to be 80%. So that's quite an important difference. Historically, Philippine presidents have been popular early on in their presidencies. So one could say, well, this is just typical in the Philippines. But given how radical Duterte's policies have been and the fact that people themselves show concern about being targeted in this, it's quite extraordinary that 4/5 of Filipinos are still sticking with him. There's some indications that the administration is worried. This change in the drug policy, at least on the surface, to move it from the police to the agency concerned with drugs in the Philippines, and this administration using less violent techniques to deal with it, is perhaps a kind of concession he's making. He's also beginning to raise other issues. So I think there may be a concern on the part of the administration as protests within the Philippines mounted in August, that popularity might not hold out forever. But for now, it's holding pretty firm.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just start from here maybe. If you could just identify yourself first and briefly. Thank you.
My name is John Davies. I'm a guest of my cousin David Lawrence, one of the long-standing members of the Hong Kong FCC, visiting for the first time to Hong Kong. Was his election, and I missed this if you clarify this, was his election seen as legitimate, and are there term limits?
It was legitimate. Clearly he won. There's no doubt about that. Quite by Philippine standards, you have to think of the Philippine electoral system is similar to the French number of candidates, but there's no second round. So Duterte wins with nearly 40% of the vote, which in the Philippine context is quite a bit. And that was twice as much as the second place candidate. So he won quite clearly. His term is limited to 6 years. There's only a one-term policy in the Philippines, concern about, a person establish himself as a second Marcos. However, one thing I didn't talk about is the issue of constitutional reform, which is about to take place, it seems. And there the issue will be, will it remain a presidential system? Could it become a semi-presidential or parliamentary system? In that context, could Duterte stay on? He's repeatedly said he doesn't want to. He also suffers from ill health, it seems, at least rumors to that effect. He's fairly old and has some self-admitted health problems, but potentially that issue could be reopened if there's constitutional change, as I expect there will be.
How old is he?
I've forgotten his exact age. 72.
Lady.
Yes, I'm Marguerite Yates from the HSBC. How does the drug problem in the Philippines compare with other Southeast Asian countries? In other words, so there's this war on drugs, but do they have a particularly serious drug problem? And what drugs are we talking about? Where are the drugs coming from? I understood a lot of the drugs are coming from China. Is he tackling the source of the drugs?
That question should be easy to answer, but it's surprisingly difficult to answer. Yes, the drugs probably mostly come from China. The smuggling episode I mentioned that occurred just a few months ago, all these drugs were smuggled in. The reason they were discovered is China told the Philippines, we have discovered this shipment, it got through your customs, and the customs official who was involved in that is linked to the president's son. So quite a major scandal. But as of yet, it hasn't been more substantially proved, and Duterte seems to have survived that episode as of yet. He has talked about dealing with that problem, but this shows that that's been very ineffective. The customs has also had a series of scandals under Duterte's predecessor Aquino. Aquino had to fire a number of customs officials. So has Duterte. So the customs is not doing well. So apparently these drugs are just coming in through customs, many of them. There is some domestic production, but the outsourcing from China seems to be very important. In terms of the numbers of users, when Duterte came to office, his own drug administration said there were something like 1.8 million users, which in a country of 100 million is not huge and doesn't make the Philippines out to be a particularly endangered place if you think about the drug epidemic in the U.S., but also in other places in the world. Duterte had a very different narrative. He said, this country is being engulfed in drugs. Drugs are ruining our communities. And he claimed there were over 3 million drug users. And when his official from the Drug Administration begged to differ, he got fired. So it's a very political issue. And now Duterte's come up with new figures that suggest the number of drug users is much higher than that even. And Duterte himself claims to be surprised how many drug users there actually are in the country. So this is also an extremely politicized matter. But I think it's fair to say, given that the figures before he came to office were rather low, that clearly he politicized this issue. I mean, drugs are a serious problem. They're also a particularly serious problem in a context of weak institutions where, people can buy their way, so the accusation, and there seems to be a lot of truth in it, buy their way out of jail if they're wealthy, drug lords and so on. There have been untouchable politicians linked to the drug industry. Duterte's certainly right about them. A couple have been targeted. There was a famous sort of rub out in the summer of one of these political families, was very popular. The problem is serious, but it doesn't seem to be nearly as overwhelming as Duterte claims.
Florence?
Thank you. I'm Florence de Changier, I report for Le Monde and the French National Radio. Could you elaborate on the role and the relationship that Duterte has with the Catholic Church? Because it's famous to be important and influential. And you said a few words, but not much. I wonder if their influence is raising or weakening.
Duterte has a rather antagonistic relation with the church. He claims he was abused as a child by a foreign priest from the U.S., I think. So that fits into that narrative. He has accused the church of hypocrisy. Of course, there have been sex scandals, as in most churches around the world. Also, some accusations that the church was susceptible to bribery in earlier periods, and so on. So he's used that kind of thing. I mean, we know that the Catholic Church, although extremely influential, and the Philippines has some of the most conservative social laws in the world, still no divorce, for example. Due to the Catholic Church's influence, it doesn't have a great deal of impact on electoral results. So Estrada was hated by the Catholic Church, still easily elected in 1998. But this is the first president who's spoken out so openly against the church. Ramos was, by the way, also opposed by the church because he was Protestant, but didn't take that sort of antagonistic standpoint. The church has, if I just follow up on that, the church has again found its voice. Early on, it seemed to be on the defensive. Duterte kept threatening, if you speak out, I'll reveal your dark secrets. But now a number of bishops in particular, in areas where drug killings have been particularly high, have been quite outspoken. So I think the church's role reminds me anyway of the role it played in the early 1980s to the mid-1980s against the Marcos dictatorship. It's been quite outspoken. It's a leading voice in the opposition.
Thank you. Just on the left here, please. Yeah.
Hi, Michael Gibson, Lim Advisors. One of the country's biggest problem, if not the bigger, is the inequality of land ownership. He tried and used that as part of his electoral arguments, but seems to be unwilling to go after that. What has changed?
Well, I was trying to suggest that, I'm making sort of a Trump-esque argument, right? Trump claims to be the friend of the working class white man in the U.S. who's been left behind. Duterte was trying to say, alongside his promises to crack down on drugs, I will also, bring about social reforms. He talked about ending the short-term contractualization. He also talked about land reform. The other important point to understand is he's engaged, or soon to be re-engaged, it seems, with negotiating with the communist left, which has had this insurgency that's been going on for half a century. It's quite an extraordinary story that's still underreported. That insurgency survives despite the collapse of European communism, despite the lack of support from China. There's still an important insurgency in certain parts of the country. So Duterte is engaged in these negotiations, and part of those negotiations will involve social reforms. And he also had 3 cabinet members. Some of them are now gone from the cabinet, which also raises questions about how serious he is about social reforms. But the point is that he may commit to these kind of reforms if he comes to a deal with the communist left. That, of course, is still very uncertain. Nonetheless, in his first year in power, he's done very little on that front. It's really been all about drugs. Nothing substantial on land reform, very little also on this short-term contractualization issue and other major social issues of concern.
Victor?
Victor Mallet from the Financial Times. Is there a difference with Trump's America in the sense that, and I'm not sure if this is an advantage or a disadvantage for Duterte, in the sense that the non-election aspects of a free democratic society are very under par in the Philippines. In other words, you have a police force that is hugely corrupt, a justice system that seems to have been corrupted as well. It sort of reminds me a bit of India in that sense, where you have an electoral system that is, usually okay, but then the other bits of making a society with the rule of law are not there. I mean, I think there was some South Korean businessman who was kidnapped and a ransom demanded, and he turned out to be at the police headquarters in Manila, I think, or in Quezon City or something. So, is that good or bad for Duterte? I mean, could it be his downfall, or can he use that to his advantage?
In the short run, it's been an advantage because my suggestion was, in a country of such weak institutions, then if somebody promises, I can sort things out. The police don't do a good job combating the drug situation. I will step in and make sure they do it. I will be the one who has the political will to clean things up. And I've done it before. I did it in Davao, which is admittedly kind of a far-fetched comparison, a city of 1 million compared to 100 million in the Philippines as a whole. And he has admitted that he underestimated the corruption within the police itself. And so after this killing of the South Korean businessman, which is really unbelievably scandalous, as you said, his body is found in police headquarters by policemen involved in the drug crackdown, who had been extracting ransom from his widow, even though he was already dead. I mean, just unbelievable scandal. And Duterte had to pause his drug war, but he only did so for a month. And he claimed to have dealt with the problem in the police, sending a few off to Mindanao. But it's really a question whether he can gain firm control over the institution. His police chief has also been questioned quite a bit about whether he can. He also comes from Davao, whether he can really get things under control. Has Duterte chosen the wrong instrument for his drug war? And the drug administration has done, it seems, a more effective job, much less violently. I think that is really a potential problem for him. And of course, this killing of the 17-year-old student, Kian de los Santos, is another example of that. Clearly, just taken away by policemen, then executed summarily. This is an indication that there could be more and more scandals to come. There's also an issue raised about how many people killed in the drug war are actually being killed by policemen to silence those that they've dealt with in the past in their own drug dealings. So it's very deep levels of corruption involved there. And as those accusations mount, I think that could be a problem for him.
Okay, time for one very brief last one question for you. Oh, all right, brief if you can. Thanks so much.
This may involve just you coming up with a name or two. This will be quick. Joel Lakin, IPPF. We're involved with investments in the Philippines. Has there been any indication of a successor? Is there anybody rising up somewhere within his camp or camp followers, so to speak, to stagger in his footsteps?
Interestingly, there hasn't. His police chief, known as Bato, is kind of put himself forward a bit as a potential successor, or at least he's been making noises to that effect. But I don't think he's taken very seriously about a lot of people. I think that would be a real problem for Duterte, is within his camp. And of course, he's got the issue of his vice president who's opposed to him. So I don't think there is a clear successor in the wings at the moment.
Excellent. Okay, well, so we're on 2 p.m. People have to go back to work, but could you all just join me, please, in thanking Professor Thompson for such a thorough walkthrough of the Philippines?